Last week we dwelt in the third letter to the churches, meaning the qualities of God in Christ. And the letter was to the angel of that church in the city of Pergamos, and this was to the angel which is Christ within you. And we learned during this letter that Jesus was never crucified. That all self-being spirit, individual self is spirit, and all that can be crucified is the image in mind, called physical form, which, when spirit is realized, becomes a spiritual, divine image, and there's no body there to be crucified, to be sick, to be buried. And this was basically the essence of the letter to the church at Pergamos. Now, it was necessary for us to reach that point where we can understand that the Spirit of God cannot be crucified, and that the Spirit of God is all there is. It was necessary in order to reach into a new level of ourselves, leading to the fourth dimension of consciousness. A level that is only attainable when you have overcome the material consciousness of this world. And now in the fourth letter to the churches, there is a letter to the angel of the church of Thyatira. Now this is a message about love, but you'd never recognize it because it's also about a woman named Jezebel, who represents self-love. And although it's very easy to do an inspiring talk about love and how beautiful love is and how divine love sustains the universe, most of us have heard inspiring talks about love. And they're only one side of the coin. We find something new must be added to our understanding of divine love. Something must be cut away. Something must die in us for the true higher understanding of divine love to come into our experience. And that is the purpose now of this letter to the churches. It begins, "And unto the angel of the church in Thyatira write, These things saith the Son of God, who hath his eyes like unto a flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass." Now the eyes like unto a flame of fire. This is the way of speaking of omniscience, having all wisdom. And the feet of burning brass. Again, feet often refers to wisdom in the sense that which you know you walk upon. And so this wisdom is of enduring qualities of brass. In other words, he who is speaking to us is he who is omniscient with that wisdom which is enduring. You are one with source when you hear the words of the Spirit through John. And he is addressing the Christ within you, the Father within, who is the Son of the Father infinite. He is addressing that quality of love of the Father which is omnipresent to your being. He is talking directly to the quality of divine love in you, to make your outer consciousness aware of this inner divine love that is there awaiting your recognition. I know thy works, and charity, and service, and faith, and thy patience, and thy works, and the last to be more than the first. He is telling you and me that the quality of love in us is infinite, and therefore we are in a progressive state now, rising from one level of releasing love to a higher level in which the quality of the last will be greater than the first. We are imperfect now in our understanding of the infinite love within us. But as we proceed, as we open, as we expand, as we release concepts, that love within us will expand within us, flowing forth, and we will be able to experience more divine love than we have in the past as we do certain things. Paul has told us that love is the fulfilling of the law. And there are certain aspects of that we should consider. Why is love the fulfilling of the law? Because when you have released all that is a barrier to love, then that love flows infinitely, fulfilling the law of the Father in you. In other words, love flowing infinitely through you is a sign that you have attained the realization of one infinite consciousness. And when you have attained that realization, then one infinite consciousness fulfilling itself fulfills all divine law. So you see, it isn't that you become more loving to fulfill the law. It's that because you are fulfilling the law, you become more loving. The love is the sign that you are fulfilling the law. For as you fulfill divine law, love flows to tell you that you are in the one consciousness now. And when that is happening, when you are in the one consciousness, and love is fulfilling the law, then all that the Father hath is made manifest as your experience, progressively, continuously, and without interruption. It is to this infinite, divine power of love in you that infinite Christ speaks to Christ within you, saying, "Awake, thou that sleepest, Christ will give thee light. The light of love will flow. And in that love flowing, there is no power between heaven and earth that can stand in the way of that perfect love." Now, of course, this would not be given to us if it were not a possibility. And so each of us is awakened to the fact that divine, infinite love is already established as the basis of our being. It is not external to us. It is not waiting in the future. It is present. It is here. It is now. It is within your consciousness. And when you have learned how to acknowledge its presence, it will manifest in your visible experience. So this purpose now is to release that invisible, infinite love into visible manifestation, freeing you from the bondage of all that is contrary to that perfect love. Up to now, you have experienced love, but only in a measure. Your last works will be greater than your first, for you are mounting up the scale of love, learning to cut away those qualities in you which have been the barrier to the full realization of being. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, and that notwithstanding refers to, notwithstanding the fact that up to now you have shown some charity, some patience, some service, some of the faith, I still have somewhat against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants, to commit fornication, and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. Now Jezebel represents a quality common to every person on the earth. Historically, she married a king. He was a king of Israel in those days, named Ahab. And the symbology there is that the king of Israel had divided his kingdom. He had married outside of Israel. He was in a divided consciousness. Israel standing for divine wisdom. And now the king had married a foreigner, the daughter of Ethbaal of Tyre. And Jezebel was a religious fanatic. So much so that murder was one of her great long suits. She murdered anyone who opposed her, if he was a priest of God or not. And now Israel, or divine wisdom, man's quest for the realization of oneness, was challenged by this religious fanatic who called herself a prophetess. And she was opposed by only one man. That one man knew that Jezebel had no knowledge of the one God. As a matter of fact, Elijah, who opposed her single-handedly and defeated her, his own name means, my God is I am. That's the meaning of Elijah. My God is I am. And so in the symbology you find I am, the one infinite self represented by Elijah, who worships within, in the temple of the inner spirit, opposing Jezebel, who is teaching the children of Israel to worship in the external, to worship idols, to worship golden calves. And this was then outer worship and inner worship. brought face to face. Material consciousness and spiritual consciousness. And now the Spirit is saying to Christ within you, you have tolerated this woman Jezebel in your midst. This self-love, which is opposed to divine love. And the target is set as divine love cannot be released into the fullness of being where you stand until you have outgrown Jezebel, self-love. And that's why we're not speaking today inspirationally about love, because the real inspiration will come when we learn how to overcome self-love. Then we will experience that resident infinite love of our being, and we will not be led as Jezebel was by her own self-love. Briefly, she started off murdering priests. Then she had her husband, the king of Israel, hit upon a very interesting little scheme. Already, the knowledge of one God had disintegrated among men, and when he came into the throne, they had already built a few other altars around the country, and the very essence of oneness was symbolized by the Hebrew ark. The ark was placed in Jerusalem. There you worshipped, and nowhere else. There you worshipped that ark. And they all made pilgrimages to Jerusalem at least once a year to be in the presence of the ark. And this symbolized worshipping in oneness. Very few really knew what they were doing, but that was the purpose that was given to Moses, to unify all Hebrew religion into the knowledge of one God. That then deteriorated because men didn't know what one God meant. To them it meant the opposite of many gods. They did not know that one God meant one being, which embraces all and is the only being on the earth. Yes, Moses knew, Jesus knew, John knew, but now King Ahab knew nothing of this whatsoever. And so what's the difference if we worship that ark in Jerusalem, or we have a few idols around here, just so long as people worship something? And now the idea of Christ within is completely unknown. And people are said to worship Baal. Baal was the god that Jezebel brought. And whenever we worship, not within, not of the Spirit, but something outside of ourselves, we are worshiping Baal. Baal is a symbol of external worship. And of course, prayers to Baal, prayers to these idols were meaningless. Sacrifices to these idols were meaningless. No prayers could be answered by the idol. All external prayer was revealed as a nothingness, without divine substance. But this was what was happening to the great message of one. And Elijah could not stand still. Now you see, Elijah in you must come where self-love is. Elijah, who could stand and come to the king and say very briefly to him, I see we're going to have a rain. And the king would say, a rain? Well, we've had a famine in this country for 3 years. I've been waiting for you to come and bring the rain. Where is it? And Elijah would send a servant to Mount Carmel and tell him to look out. The servant looked out. No rain. He'd come back and report nothing. 7 times he was sent back. 7 times. Just like the 7 letters, the 7 degrees, the 7 steps of initiation leading to Christ consciousness. And on the 7th time, he saw a little cloud. That's all, just a little cloud, far off. And he reported that to Elijah, and Elijah said to the king, better get in your chariot and drive away before the rain prevents you from driving. In Christ consciousness, he did not have to depend upon the external evidence. What he saw with his eyes did not determine the truth of being. What he knew in his consciousness was the truth. It wasn't long before the rains came, before the famine was over. Christ consciousness alone could accomplish what nothing else could. Christ consciousness could manifest as the harmony of being, a need fulfilled. Not the worship of the idols of Baal, not external worship. And then there was another scene where all of the priests of Baal, in this case 450 of them, were challenged by Elijah. The challenge in those days was who could bring fire out of the sky to the altar. He personally was going to see that Jezebel's way of worship was banished from Israel. And so they went about their frenzied and frantic way of bringing fire from the sky to the altar. They whipped themselves, they rolled in the aisles, they prayed, they chanted, they did everything they knew, but no fire. And Elijah simply said, is your God sleeping? Where is this fellow Baal? What's he doing? Doesn't he hear you praying to him? And then Elijah very simply went inside to his own inner self, praying for nothing, recognizing that every need in the Father is fulfilled, now, finished, waiting to appear visibly through the witness of a consciousness that knows. And lo and behold, there was fire on the altar. And this was the symbol of the Christ within overcoming the impossible odds of the 450 who opposed Elijah. And so now Jezebel had to go to more stringent methods. She had to murder a few more people because her 450 priests lost their lives after having lost this wager with Elijah. So she determined Elijah was on her list. She'd have to get rid of him. Again, there's your symbology. The self-love in us, when it sees the handwriting of the Christ, it begins to more belligerently oppose that Christ. So she had on all kinds of methods. But it wasn't enough for her to introduce idolatry and worship of false gods. She was a demagogue at heart. And so once she discovered that there was a landowner who would not sell his land to her husband who wanted it. The husband wouldn't do anything about it, but she would. On some trumped-up charges, she got rid of him. Murder. And now we find that her false worship overlapped into other ways of life that were false. She used the government for personal gain. She introduced new ways of corruption. Always within us, self-love looks for self-gain. Self-love does not love our neighbor. Self-love plans. Self-love desires. Self-love seeks. And we must then learn that the Jezebel, the self-love, representing our lower self, is the fanatic within each material consciousness that is ever at war with Elijah, the Christ, the will of the Father. Jezebel ultimately died in a very strange way. It is said that the dogs ate her carcass. All that was left was skull, palms, and I think her feet. Nothing, you see. And this is the symbology that we are to come to that place where all that is signified by Jezebel in this world, in us, is routed out of our consciousness. Now you may say, I'm not a religious fanatic. I'm not corrupt. I'm not in favor of the government threatening people and coming down and restricting human rights. But there is in each of us an age-old bondage to the past, something that will not let us move out of old habits. Even though we see the benefits of the new, we will cling to yesterday. And what this is trying to make us do is to see the need for a total shake-up, a major change, and establishing a new set of motives, a whole new way of life, a complete break with yesterday, so that all bondage to the past habits of the world consciousness that are clinging to us, trying to expel the higher impulses, are carefully found, discovered, probed within us until, by clearing out, by purifying, by reaching the point where I am not in a state of self-love, but in a state of glorifying the love of the Father, I can be that place where the light of the Christ shines through. As long as there is self-love, there is a second self. I die daily, says Paul, to self-love. I am reborn of the Spirit, says Jesus, reborn from self-love to that which is Christ-love. Now, how can you avoid self-love if you still have a self? The very natural instinct of each of us is to preserve this self, to hold on to it, to improve it. And we must learn that divine love cannot flow in a human selfhood. There is no place in a human selfhood that will permit divine love to flow. Jesus realized that only the Spirit of God is a channel for divine love. And all through the Bible you will hear, walk in love. Love one another as I have loved thee. Whoever loves this world is not loved by the Father. What are they telling us? They're telling us one of the greatest revelations we will ever hear, and one which we have never had to face, that we must do as Jesus did. not only to be reborn of the Spirit, but to realize that we never were born into form. Deep back in your past is a birth of a form. And as long as that birth of a form remains in your consciousness, that which was born you will love. You will protect it. You will strive to preserve it, to improve it, to build it, to glorify it. And out of that hypnosis, we must move as quickly as we become aware that to follow the Christ is not to glorify the human selfhood. We all have sought and yearned for divine love, and we have not found it because that human selfhood, which we think was born one day, is the barrier. You take a little infant, yourself, when you first appeared. What is that child? Something has happened to make it conscious. And slowly, its way of consciousness becomes what it touches, what it hears, what it smells, what it sees. Just little pinpoints of consciousness expanding. Where is this coming from? We have discovered it is not coming from God. The parent of that child is not God. The parent of a mongoloid is not God. The parent of a blue baby is not God. The parent of a stillborn child is not God. The parent of human flesh is not God. Woman, says Jesus, what have I to do with thee? My name isn't human flesh. My name is light, the light of Christ. Jesus is telling his mother and us that she did not give birth to Jesus. Mary did not give birth to Jesus. Call no man your father upon this earth, for one is your Father. Spirit is not born through a human womb. You were not born through a human womb. Spirit is spirit and never changes. I die daily, says Paul, to the belief that I came through the process of human birth. Something else happened. It wasn't what the world believes. And it is that false belief that I came through human birth that creates the entity that must love itself and steps away from divine love, steps into self-love, and invites Jezebel to take over. Now, as this little infant you were became more conscious through the senses, day by day, you developed an image of yourself, which you call your body. and you had a mind, and as these both developed, this became a you. And you were taught to learn things, to improve yourself, to study hard, to make something of yourself, to become somebody. You were prepared to go out and be married, to raise families, all completely unaware of your spiritual being, which was never born and will never die. And this spiritual being that was never born and will never die, this Christ, this eternal self, has ever been yourself, and is yourself now, and is in the love of God. For the Christ, and only the Christ, has received the love of the Father. Christ is the child of love. When Mary was lifted to realize that the Spirit of God indwelled her and would now come forth to appear as a form, she was setting the pattern for the children of tomorrow, for the parents of tomorrow, for the new consciousness on the earth which can know that only one self is expressing, there are no others. There is no woman in the world who will ever give birth to a new life, a second life. For one life is the only life, and it has been established long before we appeared in form. That life was the life that the world called Jesus. That life is the life that the world calls you. That life is never born. And your awareness of yourself as that life and the qualities of that life will ultimately bring you out of that false sense of personal love, of personal need for protecting something that isn't there. And we will develop a completely new concept of body. Not of a physical body, but of that spiritual body which Paul tells us was not made with hands. No matter how hard you try, there is this human self of you which demands certain attention. It is expressing itself. It moves out into the world. It does. It says. It sees. It requires. And that self can never become spirit. That self is the imitation of yourself. That self is the barrier to divine love. You cannot bring divine love into that self. You must step out of that self into self to discover that divine love is already present, awaiting your dying daily to that false self. You could not crucify Jesus because he had never been born. He was in the consciousness of the eternal life. We are that same self, who have never been born. And only through dying daily to that self, and all that it represents, do you discover the great secret that life begins when a corn of wheat is planted in the ground. When that corn of wheat is planted in the ground, it opens up, and something is born that couldn't be born any other way. The death of the corn of wheat is the birth of that which comes from that death. When we are told that the dead will rise from their graves, we are being told that we have the opportunity to open ourselves to love when we remove the barrier of a me that has no real existence. You cannot live spiritually in the flesh. The flesh profiteth nothing. The flesh is like grass. He who lives by the flesh shall die by the flesh. He who lives by the flesh shall find corruption. These are not the things we want to hear. But Spirit is not concerned with what we want to hear. Spirit is concerned with freedom in spirit. And deeper within us, these are the things we know we must hear. For always the flesh has rules of its own that it clings to. It is interested in God's glory after its own glory. Me first, and then maybe God. But the Spirit says we will not have a divided consciousness. You cannot glorify the Father and glorify a human self too. And so you see, we're not in a level of the message that permits us to veil the truth from ourselves or from others, or to make pretenses to ourselves. We must face the fact that dying daily means coming to that ultimate place in consciousness where I have found my pre-existent self to be my present self, and have removed the illusion that the birth of a body image was the beginning of me. Now, if you don't do that, here's what happens. Just for a moment, imagine that over here is your human birth, and over here on the other side is your human death, and in between is your present form, your body. From human birth, you have come to this place called body. And this body that you walk in now represents your concept, your complete consciousness from human birth up to this moment is represented by your body, for it is the outpicturing of your consciousness. And from this point, you will move out to human death. And that journey from here, from this body to human death, will be the balance of your journey from human birth to human death. This body in the middle now is all you've got to show for it, because this is what we have considered to be us. Now along comes a man like Joel and says, take that human birth over there and see it as the beginning of a parenthesis and dissolve it in your mind. Now take that human death over there and dissolve it in your mind. What have you got? There's no human birth, there's no human death. There's just continuous divine life. Now what's going to happen out here to this form? It's going to lose the consciousness of having been squeezed in between the cradle and the grave. It isn't just moving in this span at all. That was the illusion. Once birth is out of the way, death is out of the way. Nothing can die that wasn't born. Now, instead of being fed from a lifespan into a body, we are fed from an infinite span. The infinite is feeding this form instead of this little lifespan. That's why we learn to get out of the belief in birth, out of the belief in death. I don't have this little span that I must glorify, but rather the eternal self can now flow freely once you have removed these barriers of concept, of a beginning and of an ending. Because Spirit says, I am the beginning and the end. Not you. You didn't begin and end. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the all. Relax. Relax. The kingdom of God within you didn't begin with the cradle, and it won't end with the grave. Get rid of that old concept. Get rid of Jezebel. That's what self-love is all about. Filling this little span. And the span is illusion. You have no span. You are life itself. Life being itself. And now the consciousness, which had glorified this span of life and sought to protect it and improve it, discovers it has no span of life at all to protect. You are dividing the garment of the Father into the belief that God's life had a little lifespan called you. And it doesn't. There is no lifespan at all. And now in your fidelity to truth, not in the glorification of personal self, everything must go that tries to support the idea of a lifespan between the cradle and the grave. Woman, what have I to do with thee? My life isn't between the cradle and the grave. I am the light. I am the child of God. Call no man upon the earth your father. You were immaculately conceived of the Spirit. And it is this knowledge that must come into play in your consciousness. Whereas the world has wondered, did Jesus have a human father or not? Was it possible for a man to have a human mother and a divine father? The truth is that he didn't have a human mother either. And there was no Jesus either. There was the living Spirit of God that men called Jesus. But it knew itself to be what you and I must learn that we are. That Spirit of God, which is conceived only by the Father and then appears as an image through the Mother. Yes, the image is there, but it is only an image appearing through another image. And those images are important. They are the visible evidence of your invisible spiritual identity. Wherever there is a visible image called a form, you are looking at the visible evidence of an invisible spiritual identity. And that invisible spiritual identity is your neighbor. The recognition of it is your love. And if you want divine love to bring its miracle into your experience, then you cannot set up barriers and divide one neighbor from another, because until the one infinite Spirit is all that you accept as the reality of life, divine love will not flow through that infinite Spirit into your experience. So we're coming to a place where we have to learn to set up habits. Habits that will establish the consciousness of divine life as your life, and divine life as the life of everyone you know. These habits must be established, because otherwise world thought will erase even your greatest intentions. Now, let's take a mother who's worried about her daughter. Strangely enough, the mother's idea is that she, being a mother, must watch out for her daughter. She must see that her daughter doesn't do this or that. And usually there's more of a sort of a general telling the shaved tail what the shaved tail ought to do. It's as if the daughter has to live her life in accordance with what the mother feels the daughter should do. And so all kinds of psychological padlocks are established. You must not do this, you must not do that, you must not do the other. On Friday and Saturday this can be done, but on Thursday and Wednesday, no. And as far as my life, well, it may not be the best, but don't go by what I did. I've learned through experience, and I am telling you what to do. Now then, in this kind of a picture, we have the old-fashioned way in which a parent takes care of a child. We have the mother idea, that I am here to direct this child, to teach her. And if I don't teach her, how will she know? Now that used to be, and probably is, what the world thinks a mother is for, but it isn't. The purpose of the mother is to open that child to the realization of divine life. And what the mother has been doing by all of her maternal materialistic guidance is telling the child to obey something external to herself. She's turning the child away from the inner spirit. Obey mother. Not obey the inner impulse. Not become aware that you are a spiritual being, but live by the rules that mother sets down. Now this was wonderful, and would be more wonderful if it worked. But strangely, it doesn't work. Because until a child finds her name to be the living Spirit of God, all kinds of physical obedience add up to absolutely nothing in the eyes of divine love. Divine love still will not function in that person because they have not come into spiritual identity. And so you find that Jezebel has many strange ways of appearing in our personalities. Always, when we are maintaining the old habits, thinking that we're doing good, there is a self-love in us which says, I'm doing good for this child, and we are really dedicated to the task, but always we are turning a deaf ear to Elijah. We're turning a deaf ear to the will of the Father in us. We're glorifying not the Father, but our concept about the Father. And it all stems from a lack of knowledge that divine life is the only life that can ever exist. Now, if you knew that your daughter were divine life, if this were certainty, my daughter is divine life, could you possibly now be worried about divine life? Do you not see then that worrying about her is the Jezebel saying, this is not divine life? the divided consciousness, which thinks it loves God, but doesn't love God enough to accept the allness of God. Would you be worrying about whether that child will marry right or wrong, or should be out at 11 or 12 or 1 or 2? Would you not know that divine life can run its own life harmoniously and perfectly? Isn't the recognition of that divine life the law of immunity, accepted, realized, and experienced? Who has loved us that way? Who has loved us as divine life? Whom have we loved as divine life? And is there any other life? And so you see, generation after generation after generation, embedded in us, planted so deeply that it would take centuries to even uncover where it began. We have all seen separate selves out here. We have never seen one life. And as long as you are seeing separate selves, you are still in a sense of personal self. Now, there may not be more than 5 in the classroom who are ready to see oneself everywhere, divine self. But I can assure you, those 5 will find divine love living their lives. Wherever you have not divided his garment, wherever you have conquered the belief that you are a separate self apart from someone else, wherever you can look out and get rid of I, me, thou, him, and her, and know that all that is there, where the images appear, is one divine self, then something happens to you that is the ultimate destiny of everyone on this earth. You have sought your center. You say to yourself, let me find my center. Where is that center? What is that center? When you find your real center, it will be closer to this. You will look out at your daughter, and you will say, there goes divine life. The one invisible self is there. And there goes my son, and he is divine life, the one invisible self. And here am I, and I am divine life, the one invisible self. Well, there are 3 forms, but there's only one divine self. And behind these 3 forms are that one divine self that I am, she is, and he is. Now let's get rid of I, me, he, and she, and just live in the knowledge that there is one divine self. As I rest in that, the law of that one divine self is functioning in my being. It is the law of love. It is fulfilling the law. It is maintaining its perfect divine selfhood in spite of what you may see in the way of physical images. When something in you says that is true, you will rest in that knowledge that there is one divine self over this entire earth. I am that one divine self. And when I find the one divine self in me, that is the center, but not of my body. It is the center of the infinite self. My divine self in me is the center of the infinite. The entire infinite universe functions through the center of myself. I am the center of my universe. And you cannot be the center of your universe when you are a personal self, apart from the one divine self all around you. And so you limit yourself to this birth span from beginning to end because I am a personal me. And the glory and grace of the infinite never touches us when we are so limited in our consciousness. Now then, there is one infinite self, and there is no one to be excluded from that. Every image is a challenge and a test. Do you accept the image or the one infinite self that is there? What does your consciousness accept? God or mammon? Invisible spirit or physical appearance? You see, this must be lived with until you have caught that all that can be there is God. Your daughter was God all the time. Your son was God all the time. And you were worrying about God coming home early or late, God getting married correctly or not. You were accepting that there was a birth. The Hebrews didn't understand one God either. They thought it was one God up there and all of us Hebrews down here. But it wasn't. Each Hebrew was a physical image of an invisible divine life that could never be separated from itself. There was one divine life, and that one divine life was the one God. And every physical form was merely the evidence of mental concepts that had been entertained about that invisible. Concepts that had entertained themselves into a form, an outer appearance, a concept that had no relationship to the reality. The form that is born becomes the form that ultimately dies, and you find then that it was never of the Father. It was a changing image.